Good morning, everyone. I'm Melissa Frick, one of the business training managers here at ANZ, and I'm super excited to launch our new webinar, Measuring Your Emissions, How Your Data Can Help Power Your Sustainability Goals. Just some bit of housekeeping before we kick into the webinar. Displayed on screen is just our disclaimer. I'm not going to read it word for word, but basically this isn't in place of any personalized advice for you and your business, but it is of a general nature with our experts today. So we have Becky Lloyd, Chief Executive Officer from Toitū Envirocare, and she'll be talking through why, how, who, and the trends this morning. Welcome along, Becky. We have Bevan Holdaway, head of our Insights team at ANZ, who helped with the latest Insights paper that he will be talking about this morning. Welcome along, Bevan. Joop Verbeek, Managing Director from IncaFé Organic Coffee, and he'll be sharing with you his amazing sustainability story. Thank you all for being here this morning. It's fantastic. So next, we're just going to pop up a quick poll on your screen. So we'd love to hear where you are in your sustainability journey. Are you conceptually just thinking about it? Implementation stage, you've started your sustainability journey, or you're actually in the growth stage, you're already doing it, but you're looking for that next step. So we'll just give it a couple of seconds for you all to complete that, and we'll share the results with you. Great, many of you are thinking about it. Some of you started, awesome, and a few are even in growth stage. Fantastic work. A couple more seconds there. Great. Yep, so majority are looking, 70% of you are thinking about it, but great to have you along to learn some stuff today. 23% of you have started it. Well done, pat on the back to you. And the growth stage, 8% are looking for that next step. Well done to each of you. If we all do one little thing, it'll make a massive difference overall as you're here today. Now, before I hand over to my speakers, I just want to share what we do here at ANZ. So we do a lot to contribute in a sustainable way. So on the page, you'll see our ESG, or our environmental, social, governance and community. A couple of things I'd like to share that are really key to me is we've been carbon neutral since 2010. We've had a living wage accreditation as an employer since 2019. We offer a diverse and inclusive workforce. We also have a staff foundation and a charitable trust, which ANZ matches staff donations, and we donate to many charities every year. We've also donated $2 million to support vulnerable people during COVID-19. And we're a principal sponsor of Sustainable Coastlines and Love Your Water Tour. Now, at this point, I'd like to then next hand over, we'll just drop that poll, next hand over to Becky from Toitū.
Luna, could you please make me visible, because I don't have those controls. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Becky Lloyd toko ingoa, kei Toitū Envirocare aho, e mahi ana, nō reira tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you very much, Melissa, for that introduction. I'm delighted to be talking to you today about climate action. And I'll spend the next 15 minutes or so just talking you through a little bit about, as Melissa said, what does it all mean? How do you go about it? What should you be thinking about? As I said, I'm the Chief Executive of Toitū Envirocare. We are a wholly owned subsidiary of Manaaki Whenua Landcare Research, which is the government science research institute that is responsible for the science of the land. And so that means we're 100% owned by the government, but we are actually set up as a business, but we're really a business for impact. And to represent that, we're a certified B Corp, which means that we have to take the perspectives of a whole range of stakeholders into consideration rather than just pursuing profit. We are members of a whole range of organisations that champion sustainability, including the Climate Leaders Coalition, the Sustainable Business Council and the Sustainable Business Network. And what we do is we operate credible environmental and carbon certification programs. And we are accredited by the Joint Accreditation System of Australia and New Zealand in the way that we do that, and they really make sure that we do it properly in line with international standards. So why are we talking about climate action today? So this is very timely, actually, because I'm sure you're aware that COP26 is going on quite literally as we speak. They'll be negotiating deep into the night in Glasgow. And this is why, because we're already seeing the impacts of climate change, particularly in those parts of the world that are more susceptible anyway. So, for instance, we've seen terrible bushfire seasons in Australia and then subsequently in California last year. We have sea level rises starting to wash away some Pacific nations like Kiribati. We see the penguins of Antarctica no longer standing on sea ice, but now standing on mud, which is not good for them. And we've seen record temperatures in the Antarctic over the last couple of seasons. And then in countries like Zimbabwe, we're seeing extended drought periods, which of course makes it much more difficult for people who live there to grow food and to look after themselves. So we really need to collectively take action with urgency, as is the narrative that's coming out of COP right now. And these charts illustrate some of the key points that came out of the recent IPCC report, which is the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. And that's a group of scientists who really look at the science that's already been done and work out what it all means. And they look at it periodically. This is the update that was done in 2021, just recently, which was the 6th iteration. And there are a few new and very important things that came out of this last report. So the top left chart shows you how much warming we have already created through the emissions that we've put into the atmosphere historically. So we're already tracking at 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial times. And as you've probably heard, there's a lot of talk about 1.5 to 2 degrees. We know that we need to limit global warming as close as possible to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial times to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So that's why there's so much focus at COP on all of these nationally determined contributions and how much global warming they are going to lead to or save. The second really key thing that came out of the IPCC report was that for the first time, the scientists said it is unequivocal that humans are causing climate change. So until this point, there'd been a sort of narrative that it's probable, it's likely, but now we know that without doubt, we have caused the climate change that we're already seeing. And what that means then is that if we've caused the problem, we can't rely on natural fluctuations to solve it. We actually have to solve it as well. Hence the big focus on what can we do to take climate action. So what are we doing on a global level? So this is a picture from 2015 when the Paris Agreement was signed at COP21. And the Paris Agreement was a historic agreement. It came into force in November 2016. The mechanism that the Paris Agreement put into force was that all the signatories, all the countries that signed up, would set their own nationally determined contributions, which means their own commitments to the reductions that they would achieve in emissions, and that they would work together to achieve those. And the other really important components of the Paris Agreement is about what you'll hear termed the global north helping the global south. So acknowledging that the richer economies have benefited for a long time from fossil fuels and have caused a lot of the pollution, and the global south need a lot of support because they're not going to be able to access fossil fuels. They're not going to be able to go through the same cycle of consumption that the global north has gone through. So there's a big theme in the Paris Agreement about redistribution of funds. Within New Zealand, there's been an awful lot going on in terms of regulation, legislation, government action. So in 2019, the Zero Carbon Act was signed, November 2019. That was historic. That set in law the requirement for the government to achieve net zero by 2050. Since then, we have seen the declaration of a climate emergency in New Zealand. We have seen We've seen the legislation for climate-related financial disclosure. We've seen a cap put on the emissions trading scheme, and we've seen the creation of the Climate Change Commission. And the Climate Change Commission's role is to advise the government on how the government can achieve the targets that are set out in the Nationally Determined Contribution and in the Zero Carbon Act. So there's a lot of very strong signals coming from government. The other really key point is the government themselves have committed to a carbon neutral government by 2025, which is a very near horizon to achieve carbon neutrality. But it's not all about regulation and compliance. Consumer sentiment is really shifting as well. And you will be no doubt aware that consumers are starting to ask a lot more questions about the climate credentials of organizations and businesses. And here's a piece of data from a piece of research by Colmar Brunton in 2020 showed that 48% of Kiwis have already switched to a brand that they consider more sustainable. You can see an image here of one of the climate marches, the School Strikes for Climate from September 2019, when we were allowed to gather in large groups without masks. No doubt more of these protests will be coming back soon, and we've seen them over the last few weeks in Glasgow and in various other countries as COP26 has been underway. Now, this fella is Larry Fink. Larry Fink is the chair and CEO of BlackRock Investments, which is the largest investment fund in the world. And Larry Fink is important because he signals where flows of funds, flows of investment are going. And every year, Larry Fink sends a letter to the CEOs of the organizations, the businesses that he invests in or that BlackRock invests in, and he gives them some key points for the year. And in the letter that he sent in 2020, he sent a very, very clear message to those CEOs running those big organizations that they needed to take serious climate action and that he would be withdrawing funding from organizations that did not take serious climate action. And he would also be campaigning as a shareholder to get rid of CEOs that weren't taking climate change seriously. So that was a very, very strong shot across the bows to signal where serious investment funding would and would not be going. And we're seeing a lot of this playing out at the moment in the narrative around fossil fuels and whether it's going to be possible to get investment for fossil fuels going forward. So what does climate leadership look like if you're a business? Here are some examples, from New Zealand. Along the top, we have the America's Cup campaign in last year. The America's Cup campaign last year for Team New Zealand was carbon zero certified. They did that in order to really, I guess, to offset the impacts or the negative impacts of the sport that was being participated in. And that was sponsored actually by the Warehouse Group. The next couple of examples are a couple of carbon zero products. So the Anchor range of enhanced milks, enriched milks, and the Steinlager beer range are carbon zero products. Those are examples of the trend that we're seeing for organizations to actually demonstrate the carbon credentials of their products and to provide offsets to effectively neutralize the impacts. And then the picture on the right is Jeff and Justine Ross at Lake Hawea Station. They are very progressive regenerative farmers, and they are pioneering carbon zero or net zero merino wool, which is going into a whole range of products across the globe, some really major brands, using the great credentials of New Zealand, the New Zealand farming system to demonstrate low carbon primary produce. So we're seeing a lot of action domestically, but actually even more action internationally. So Microsoft, for instance, has set some very bold goals for carbon neutrality. In fact, they're intended to be carbon negative by 2030. They're taking responsibility for the emissions of their entire supply chain from the time that they were born as a company all the way through to end of life, to customers using their products. And they're also investing a huge amount of money in carbon removal technologies, recognizing that as well as reducing our emissions into the atmosphere, we also need to find ways to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. Walmart is doing some very similar things. Again, big investments into nature-based and technological solutions around carbon capture and storage, and Apple similarly. Why are all these organizations taking climate action? Well, there's some fundamental reasons around actually it's going to become a license to operate issue. It's no longer, as we've seen from the consumer trend, it's no longer going to be possible not to take responsibility for your impacts as an organization. But it also gives you an opportunity to differentiate, to grow your brand preference and to grow your market share, particularly if your competitors aren't quite as advanced as you are. It also gives you the opportunity to manage risk and improve efficiency. So what we find from our organizations that we work with is that carbon generally equals cost, because usually you're buying something that causes the carbon emissions. So that might be fuel, it might be business travel. So as soon as you start to become aware of those opportunities, you can both save emissions and save cost by removing anything that's non-essential. And of course, it future-proofs your business. Everything is going in this direction, and we're all going to need to be much more aware of the impacts of the behaviours that we exhibit on a daily basis. One of the things that we hear a lot is, well, I'm just a small business, or I'm an individual, what difference can I make? And it's the difference that every single person can make a difference. You contribute to the total, but also through your actions, you start to lead and demonstrate what good behaviour looks like. So we know, of course, that SMEs make up 97% of New Zealand businesses and about 30% of New Zealand's carbon emissions. And that 30% is really important. So every business that takes climate action is helping towards our net zero economy and our net zero planet. So I'd urge all of you to have a think about what you can do yourselves. So how do you go about it? What are the things you need to think about? Well, we always say you can't manage what you don't measure. So the first good step to take is to measure your emissions and to understand what the big sources of emissions are that you are generating. Once you've done that, you can set about putting together a management plan. So you can set targets for yourself, you can work out what reductions are possible. If you want to, at that point, you can then choose to offset your residual emissions. And what that does is it really puts your organization in balance at any point in time. It says, okay, over this period of time, my people have flown this far, I'm going to buy offsets to compensate for their behavior. And then I know that we're net zero at a point in time. You obviously can track progress, and you can particularly track progress on the reductions that you're planning to make and put in place. And then it's really important to talk about your success. And we'll be hearing an example of this later on in the webinar about how an organization has done all of this and has achieved some really great successes in this area. And this is the reduction hierarchy. And it's just important to touch on this because one of the most important principles is that the first thing you do in emissions management is to avoid as much as you can. So I guess it comes down to questioning everything. Think about everything you're doing and saying, do I need to do this in the course of my business, or can I avoid it? What you've got left, the essential things you have to do to run your business, then you start thinking about, can I reduce it? Can I not have as much business travel? Can people do more work remotely and not have to travel all the time? Then you get to, well, what can I replace with the activities that I've got left? How can I replace a fossil fuel based behavior with an electric behavior? For instance, can I swap out my fossil fuel car fleet for an electric fleet, for instance? And then last thing, for any unabatable emissions, as we say, anything that you can't get rid of, you can then take responsibility for them by buying offsets. Offsetting is optional, and some people think it's a good thing and some people think it's a bad thing. But what I would say is a high quality, credible offset does do a job. It channels funding to avoidance or removal projects, and it helps to get carbon either out of the atmosphere or stop it getting into the atmosphere somewhere in the system. So as long as it's done well, it's an important part of the solution set. So practically, here's something that you can do. You can get started with Toitū Carbon Assess, and we're very pleased to be partnering with ANZ to talk to you about this today. Carbon Assess is a tool that we designed specifically for small businesses, understanding that for most small businesses, it needs to be tailored to the nature of your business and the nature of your emissions. So we went through and we identified what the major emission sources are for small businesses. Essentially, that's electricity, fuel, flights, waste, and freight. And we designed this tool to make it really easy to gather all of that information, put it into the system, and then work out what your emissions look like. It enables you to benchmark your carbon emissions against other similar businesses, and also produce a report that you can share with your customers, because what we know is lots of larger organizations are going to be asking smaller organizations to share their emissions footprints with them. So we thought we'd try and make it easy to do that. So I'd just like to close with the old Earth shot. Just as a reminder as to why this is important. We're doing all of this so that we can continue to live on our beautiful planet in the way that we've enjoyed in the past, and just leave you with a call to action to take some action, to understand your own business footprint and work out what your own version of climate action looks like. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou.
Thanks, Becky. My name is Bevan Holdaway. I am the head of insights for ANZ business segment. And so I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes today, take you through some of the key insights that we gleaned from the paper, and also and share some of the research that we did in the background as well. So when we got the brief, we were really excited about putting this paper together. It is something that we've been looking at for some time from an insights perspective. So the first thing up front is that when we brought this together, it was important that we represented it for businesses of any size. So whether you're a large corporate, a small to medium enterprise, or even ANZ itself as a bank, the methods, the data, the process are all the same, regardless of the size of the entity. Now, we know that this climate theme is a fundamental macro theme that's going to persist for a number of decades. But what we were seeing was a real disconnect between what's needed to solve the problem and where businesses are really at in this cycle. So we wanted to talk about it and get that conversation on the table at a larger scale. Now, for us to do that credibly, it was important to us that we had someone alongside us with the credibility of Toitū. So we stood together alongside Toitū to bring this paper to life, and I've got over 20 years experience in carbon and emissions footprinting. And the second thing that we did was, it was important that we actually look at ourselves as ANZ alongside our customers and be prepared to talk about our journey as well as our customers. And you'll see more from the bank in terms of being very transparent about what we do going forward. So the first place to start is to close out this problem definition around emissions measurement. And here's a quote by the Minister for Climate Change, James Shaw, who said, the very first thing is to start measuring. Now that sounds really simple, but ICA and TRA did a great survey in the early part of this year, and it surveyed 500 small to medium enterprises, and around half of those businesses said, yep, we acknowledge that climate change is a really important issue, but around 70% of them said that they still don't know where to start to get underway. So what we wanted to do is break down that concept of emissions measurement into even more simple steps. And that was to really focus on the data collection piece up front. And to do that, we shared 3 case studies from customers and also ourselves at a bank around the learnings as you go through this process of capturing the data. Why did you go about doing it in the first place? How did you approach it? What were the hidden benefits that you saw along the way? What were the pain points? How long did it take? And the bottom line is, by talking about those key points, we table how to actually approach this problem. And the businesses that we showcase in the paper really showed leadership in this space and hopefully share their learnings on how they got started to inspire others to do that. So I'm not going to talk very much around this slide because regulation is a huge topic, and the big one is obviously Paris net zero target in 2050. The key thing to take away, I think, from this slide is that the tide is rising around regulation and the direction of travel will not change. And the one big one that's coming, and I'll talk about it in a little bit more detail, is climate risk disclosures, which Becky just touched on. But the key takeaway from this slide is that businesses will need to measure emissions in some way, shape or form in the very near future. So the key thing is get on board now, understand where your data is generated and start capturing those points so that you can then put it into a platform or a process that actually represents where you are on your emissions journey. So there are tangible benefits over and above just regulation to measuring emissions, and anyone who's actually been through that process knows that there are benefits around consumer preference, competitive advantage that you can gain. A classic example is we talk about a company called Alban Enterprises in the report, and they initially set out to become zero carbon because they wanted to position themselves as a leader in being carbon neutral. But after they went through that process, they discovered that other businesses in the top of the South Island around them were also going zero carbon. And so what that enabled them to do was set, and they are a tourism operator, and so they were able to connect with these other businesses in the tourism industry and create possibly one of the world's first zero carbon travel itineraries. So it was a 3 or 4 night stay that appeals to businesses, appeals to consumers who have this need or desire to have a holiday with zero emissions. Another area where businesses typically see benefit is actually the efficiencies and cost reductions that they discover through the process. One of the companies that we showcase in the report, Andrew's Property Services, went through this process and they found that their largest contributor to emissions was their fuel expense from vehicles and trucks that they owned. And so they implemented the E-Road system, which is a fleet management system. And essentially what that has enabled them to do is not only get an idea on what their fuel emissions are, but also save on tyres, fuel efficiency, maintenance, brakes, and also improved health and safety outcomes for their drivers. So hidden benefits that were not necessarily seen up front when they started out on this journey. I'll just touch on supply chain and regulation again, because one of the biggest things that will drive a lot of change in the New Zealand market is the mandatory climate risk disclosures that have been put in place by the XRB, or External Reporting Board in New Zealand. And what this means is for any bank, insurer, credit union, building society, and about 90% of the New Zealand Stock Exchange, which whether you're a listed equity company or a debt issuer, is that you will need to start reporting on your climate disclosures starting in 2023. So that's not far away, considering it's almost the end of 2021. So the point is, if you're a small to medium enterprise, you're going to have to start measuring your emissions at some point, because that regulation covers 200 of New Zealand's largest companies. And under those 200 entities, they'll have an organisational chart with many more companies underneath it, and they will be reaching into their supply chains to understand emissions. So it's the concept of emissions measurement and presenting it up to counterparties for business to business transactions is going to happen. So it's a direction of travel that's pretty much baked in. I will just drop in quickly on some technical stuff. So for those of you, and I saw 70% at the start of this session, we're starting out on their journey. Now, one of the key questions that you need to answer when you first start your emissions measurement journey is, what is my organizational and operational boundary? And also the reporting period that you're reporting for, and that's typically your financial year. Now, a great example of this is, I'll go back to Alban Enterprises, the tourism operator. When they started out setting their organisational and operational boundary, they were considering only the emissions from the water taxi business that they operate. But over time, as they went through this process, they started to broaden out their thinking to say, well, we're really interested in capturing everything that we do. We want to understand the full impact of our business on the environment around us. So they expanded the scope to include everything from the shop to the vehicles that sit outside the water taxis business. Now, most businesses will settle on that boundary and their reporting period pretty quickly. So the next step is really, okay, what data points do I need, and how would I actually go about presenting that up to another entity who was asking me to present my emissions footprint? So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which is a global standard, stipulates you present your emissions into 3 scopes. Those scopes, scope 1 is direct emissions from your business premises or vehicles. So that is fuel, refrigerant gases that you might use in your business. For agricultural customers, it might be your fertilizer that you use or your stock that you hold. Anything from basically the business in your vehicles. Scope 2 is indirect emissions, which are from imported energy, and most businesses, that's electricity imported from the grid, and that data is reasonably accessible. So normally, once you get through scope 1 and scope 2 as a business, that's the easy bit. And the data is readily available for fuel invoices and electricity and those sorts of things. But where it starts to get a little bit tricky and businesses start to encounter ways that they need to change their data collection is in scope 3. And that starts to bring in indirect emissions from anything that's critical to you providing a product or service to market, essentially. So a classic example is freight. So if you are distributing your goods and you outsource your freight to another company, it's not necessarily coming from your business or your vehicles, but someone else is incurring emissions as a result of you getting your your goods to your customer. One of the customers in the paper that talks about this is Loft Foods, and they went through a process of measuring, getting the locations of all their customers and their final destinations, and working out the kilometres to those destinations and also the shipping weights. Now, when they went through that process, it took them a little bit up front, but now they do that on a monthly basis to collect those data points and those shipping weights, because it's much easier for them to take monthly cuts of data than it is to go and look back on what happened 10 or 11 months ago. So that's how they've set themselves up to capture that data. Importantly, when you've got your data, you need to present those litres or tonnes or physical unit amounts into emissions or carbon equivalents. And so that's where Toitū's tool is really great on being able to just put those data points in and quickly know your emissions footprint and present that to others. The last slide that I will touch on is just having sustainable business goals makes good business sense. Every business that we've talked to who's gone through this process sees this has given them insights into their business that they just would not have seen before. So it just gives you another lens on your business that you wouldn't have otherwise seen. So, and another thing is that the theme that keeps popping up time and time again in these conversations is this concept of legacy. And when you talk to someone, they're really interested about leaving something for the next generation or thinking really long term around how they do their business. Now, when you go through this process, you can create an environment where people are really proud to work. And I'll just touch on the last, one of the customers in the paper, which is Andrew's Property Services, and they're thinking not just from a carbon removal or carbon reduction perspective, they're thinking about going well beyond that, being carbon positive and actually, you know, helping contribute to healing the planet and also achieving some wider sustainability development goals. So I'll just finish there. And look, I'd really like to thank the businesses that helped us put this paper together. So that's Michael and Oliver from Loft Foods, Ming and Robert from Andrew's Property Services, and Brendan from Alborn Enterprises. It was really great working with them and putting this report together. So much appreciated.
Thank you, Bevan. Good morning, everybody. Welcome. I'm sharing our sustainability journey as a small business. I will talk about offsetting emissions on a company level, on a product level, and then give a bigger perspective on the full journey of a product before wrapping up. So my name is Joop Verbeek, and with my wife, Carmen, we started IncaFé Organic Coffee in New Plymouth in 2007. Our objective is to produce high quality coffee with no negative environmental footprint, no exploitation of workers, and being chemical free. And of course, try to make a living for ourselves. So we had sustainability at the core of our business from the start, and hence we became organic, fair trade and Toitū Carbon Zero certified in the first year of business. For the majority of our coffee, we also became Fairtrade Climate Neutral certified in 2016. This is a product certification, which I will explain later. We also support various other non-certified tree planting schemes. Thank you, Luna. To give some idea what this means, last year we offset 181 tons of CO2 with Toitū certification alone, which is the equivalent of almost 26 return trips to London. Since the start of our business, we've offset with carbon credits through Toitū and climate neutral certification some 3,600 tons of CO2, which is basically planting the equivalent of some 3.6 hectares of native forest in New Zealand. So that's quite significant for a small business. Thanks, Luna. Now, what does it mean for our business to measure and offset emissions? As Becky and Bevan already explained, when you cut emissions, you most likely also create savings and become more efficient. So in general, it makes good business sense, and I can definitely attest to that. Looking at emission data gives you also another way of interrogating and challenging your expenditure in your business. When you look at emission data the first time, there are probably a few surprises. And first, that was the impact of air freight and flying. So we cut back on air freight, and already before COVID, we started to push clients for Zoom meetings. And I guess one upside from COVID is that Zoom meetings are now a lot more acceptable, and that should stay that way. It is very efficient in a lot of cases. The other one that always stands out is the cost of air conditioning units. They really use a lot of power, and we're now quite conscious about running them. For the last years, we're pretty efficient, and there are not many more emissions that we can cut drastically unless we get a step change in green technology like hydrogen burners on roasters. We also face a dilemma that using up your old equipment might be better for the environment than replacing it prematurely with new green technology, as the production of that new equipment might have a very high carbon footprint that's not factored in. So you need to factor these things in before changing equipment out. So as I said, on a business level, doing carbon zero certification is really straightforward. It takes us about 2 to 3 days to collect all emission data, mostly gas, electricity, fuel usage, and freight. And it takes us a day for the audit and any follow-up. We make use of things like fuel cards for all our company cars, so those things make it a lot easier. The total cost for us is around 0.25% of our turnover, and probably for a lot of small to medium businesses, it will be 0.1 to 0.3 of turnover, and that includes the carbon credits and time it takes. It's really not onerous, as I said, it creates savings too. Carbon zero business certification strictly looks at the emissions we create directly as a business, the emissions that we control. We also have fair trade climate neutral product certification for the majority of our coffee. And product certification looks at the emission from farm all the way to supermarket shelves of that particular product, and also takes into account the packaging. So this is a lot more comprehensive. Now, as you can imagine, product certification is a lot more complex, especially when primary products come from different places overseas. And hence, there are lots of conservative assumptions to be made by the certifiers. So this certification can become quite costly, and in many cases, it's not that practical. But our coffee has a pretty simple supply chain, which made it possible for us. Excellent. Now we'll give some more perspective along the full product journey of coffee. Now, what do you think is the biggest negative impact? Well, the answer is there. As you might have guessed, making cups of coffees uses 2 to 8 times more energy per kilo of coffee than the entire supply chain from the farm. Especially coffee machines at home can be energy hungry. Now, to help offset this, we've decided to plant a tree for every 24 kilos of coffee we sell, and we do this through Trees That Count and Trees for Survival. These are not official schemes to offset carbon credits, but they do great work. I guess this also shows how important it is to have our electricity grid powered by renewable energy and to support this as New Zealanders. What's the next question? What is the biggest positive impact along the coffee product journey? Our organic coffee plantations sequester around 10 times more carbon in the soil and in the trees than all the carbon credits we buy. You can see the trees in the picture, and the other picture is a non-organic coffee farm. Being organic has a huge positive impact on the environment, and this was one of the reasons why we wanted to work with coffee back in the late 90s when we started this journey. Excellent. So to wrap it up, what does it mean to us being a sustainable business? Foremost, we need to produce quality for the consumer to buy a product and to prove that you can have a sustainable product that tastes good at a good price point. At the end, the quality of our product is always our main focus. Being sustainable for us means foremost promoting organics. There are lots of benefits with organics, like improved biodiversity, obviously no chemicals used, clean water, but it also sequesters carbon. And in case of coffee, it actually sequesters a lot of carbon at the plantation. So it is hugely beneficial. Getting carbon zero certified was for us a no-brainer, as it goes with the organics, but also because it was easy. It's really straightforward and not expensive, as I mentioned before. Now, apart from being straightforward, it also makes good business sense, as recognition is growing in the last few years, and as many more people realize we need to consume less and we need to consume more conscientiously. Being a sustainable business also means that we have to look after our organic suppliers, who are often small farmers. We have to make sure they can make a living, and this is an important cornerstone of our business. Once on the journey of sustainability, it motivates to look beyond your direct emissions. I already mentioned the product certification that we do, which looks at the entire supply chain. And I mentioned the end user offsets that we do with tree plantings. We also developed the Forever Cup. The Forever Cup is a double-walled stainless reusable cup, removing millions of takeaway cups every year. And we also introduced home compostable packaging to remove plastic packaging. These are nice and inspirational projects to be working on as part of our sustainability journey. To finish off, we set out to have a sustainable business from the start. We're not perfect, it can always be better, and I wish we could eliminate more emissions in our business, but at least we can overcompensate by offsetting more than we admit. It is very satisfying that we have a small but yet significant impact on the environment that our children will inherit, and that's why we're doing it. My main message today is that it's not difficult to make a difference, and it feels good that we're trying. So hopefully more and more businesses will follow. Now that's the end of my presentation. I would like to thank the ANZ for organizing this important webinar, taking another step to getting all businesses carbon zero. We are passionate about this, and if there are any people that have any questions for me after this webinar, please do get in touch with me through our website or social media. And yeah, thank you. Will now hand you back to Melissa. Thanks.
Thank you, Joop. That was fantastic. And thank you, Bevan and Becky. It's really awesome to hear your points of view and your stories. So just before we move into questions, which please drop them in the box, we've got a couple of questions that have been coming through. I just want to introduce you to the great Toitū offer that we have. We'll just flip to that next slide in a second. So we partnered with Toitū, and one of the questions from Adele was the cost. So here you go, Adele. So you get 25% off your Toitū Carbon Assist subscription. So you need to be a new customer and use the ANZ discount activation code. So the subscription cost will be reduced from $30 to $22.50 excluding GST per month, or from $360 to $270 excluding GST per year. So have a look at that. Jump onto either the ANZ Insights paper or the Toitū or the Toitū website. You have been sent these resources in the invitations and will be sent it after today. So what I'd love to do is invite our panel of experts and speakers back on screen so that we can ask some questions. So we've got a question for you, Becky, to start from Adele. How is Anchor Milk achieving carbon zero status?
They have undergone a full life cycle analysis of the carbon footprint of the Anchor Milk products. So what they've done, in fact, they've been working on this for years with ag research. They've been building models to understand the emissions associated with producing milk. In a life cycle analysis, you essentially build a model that goes through from the emissions that happen on the farm, and for milk, about 75% of the emissions happen on farm, and about 75% of the emissions on the farm come from the cows. And then it goes through from farm to transport to processing to refrigeration in the supermarket, to being taken home, to being used, to being disposed, any leftovers being disposed of, and the packaging. So you basically calculate all of those emissions. You then look at what you can reduce. So you go through that emissions hierarchy that I spoke about. Are there any emissions that we could reduce in the production of this product? And then with what you're left with, you can buy offsets. And what offsets do is they essentially come from various projects, and you talk very eloquently about these, and they are fully verified as well. And you can either use New Zealand-based units, which are forestry units, or you can use international projects. And international projects vary from also being forestry-based, or you can get sort of energy efficiency, renewable energy investments, and things like that. And offsets, carbon credit projects, are essentially a way of funding decarbonisation of economies, as I was describing earlier. So that's how the whole process works. And a lot of it is about transparency, and the carbon credits, the offsets, have to fulfill certain criteria. They have to be additional, they have to be transparent, they have to be not double claimed. So there's a whole bunch of rules that sit behind the system that is actually quite well established now. After probably 15 years it's been in operation in some form.
Great, thank you, Becky. Next question from Keegan. With cash put aside for sustainability, are more companies creating green funds or offsetting their carbon? What is more beneficial to do? Do you want to take that one too, Becky?
Yeah, I can take that. It's a really great question. It's quite insightful that organizations are taking different approaches depending on their philosophies. And so, I know of organizations that are very pro offsetting because they take the stance that we want to take responsibility for everything that we're doing in any given time frame. So they believe that they need to be neutralizing their impact at every stage. A different approach is to say, we'll use a sort of an internal price of carbon, we'll measure our emissions, we'll set a price, and then we'll reinvest that internally in reducing emissions. So that might be in investing in electrification projects or things like that. So that's a strategy, for instance, that New Zealand Post has used really effectively. They have an internal decarbonisation fund. Both of those strategies are completely legitimate. As far as we're concerned, if they end up with emissions being reduced, then happy days, that's a good outcome for the planet.
Great, thank you, Becky. Bevan, one from Dave. How can construction business get started?
The same as any other business, essentially. Like I said at the start, the process for going through like emissions measurement journey is the same regardless of your service business, a building business, a bank, a small to medium enterprise. The data points all exist within your business. It's just a matter of capturing them in a consistent and structured format, and then going through the process of converting them into emissions measurement. So I would say it's the same for everyone. When we went through and we looked at the bank, our biggest challenge as a bank is that we have so many, operations and branches across the business. So we have to bring together multiple data sets from all over the business, multiple contracts with property providers, and bring that all into one central location. So for us, some of the benefit is actually having like larger supplier agreements, global supply contracts that actually be able to aggregate that data and provide it to you. So I would just say, yeah, it's the same process regardless of what business you are.
Great, thank you, Bevan. So we have one from Sam for you, Joop. What are the top 3 considerations for food supplied businesses? So for a cafe or a restaurant? Oh, you're on mute, Joop.
Yep. For food services, food businesses, I guess it's electricity and gas use. That's first the big ones. I guess if you have a cafe, you probably spend a lot of air conditioning as well. But I said they're actually very power hungry, and again, it will show up in your power bill. But yeah, those ones are the big ones. Cool. Waste, of course, is very much in focus. But overall, from a carbon perspective, it's not probably the main thing. It's more about plastics in the environment.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you, Joop. Next question. So maybe you, Bevan or Becky, are there any blue carbon offset credits in New Zealand?
I'm happy to take that.
You can take it.
Yeah,
I know the answer, but
we spend a lot of time in the offsets world. At the moment, the only type of carbon credits you can procure in New Zealand are forestry carbon credits from the ETS, New Zealand units. We're in a process of transition from the Kyoto world to the Paris world, which comes with a whole new set of rules. So MFE is currently going through a process of working out what the future sources of carbon credits within New Zealand might look like. There's a strong request from voluntary carbon actors. It's essentially private sector firms who want to take responsibility for a wider range of carbon credits to be made available in New Zealand. So there's an active conversation going on at the moment. How do we broaden out from just forestry units to add things like energy efficiency units, things like soil carbon, things like blue carbon, which is basically ocean-based things like seaweed, kelp, that kind of stuff, peatlands, wetlands. So it's known that there are lots of potential carbon credit type projects. So if you look across the ditch, for instance, in Australia runs something called an ERF, the Emissions Reduction Fund, which has a whole range of methodologies for voluntary carbon credit creation. We don't have that here yet. I'm hopeful that over time we'll be able to build something like that here in New Zealand. And there are definitely organisations working on blue carbon opportunities. Because we have, it's actually a really rich resource for us with a very large coastal area and deep sea and cold sea. So particularly down south, near Rakura, there's lots of opportunity for quite rich sequestration by kelp and so on. So I would say watch this space, but in the world of carbon projects, they do tend to be multi-year projects. Nothing happens very fast.
Great. And another one for you, Becky, is there a video or a demo video to explain the carbon assess tool?
Yes, I'm sure there is. I'll have to find out. I'll come back to you, but yes, I'm sure there will be.
We had a link. Yeah,
I
believe there's a link to it we can share with the audience, which is great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bevan, do you want to take this one? Would you recommend employing an advisor to help with the plan and measuring, or is it better to resource in-house and upskill?
It depends. If you are, it depends. If you have got the expertise in-house, you can get started essentially. But when you come to something like getting accreditation, or you want to take that additional step, I think you do need to involve an advisor. Because they'll be especially when you start talking about scope 3 emissions, right? Most people can get their fuel, their electricity and these sorts of things. But when you start talking about life cycle emissions, like Becky was talking about before, that can get quite complicated. So I would say if you want to take it to, not just do the basics, but actually take it a bit further, I think you do need an advisor. Absolutely.
Great. Thank you. And thank you, Luna. Luna's put the YouTube video in the chat box for anyone who wants the demo for the carbon assess tool. Another question is probably Becky, or probably you, Becky. When calculating emissions, does the purchase of capital equipment come into it? For example, if purchasing a new digger, is it just the operating emissions, or is there data on the impact of manufacturing the equipment?
Yeah, that's another very insightful question. The way the standards work at the moment, so if you're doing an organizational carbon footprint, which is essentially what we've been talking about here, it's operational emissions. So you don't count embodied emissions. And I was thinking that actually when we were talking about construction emissions as well. It's a good question though, because as the questioner is sort of shining a light on, there are a lot of embodied emissions in those new capital builds. So you do have to be quite thoughtful in terms of what's the right point to swap out your capital equipment. You really, and interestingly, this was reflected in the Climate Change Commission recommendations around fleet transitions. The optimal thing to do is to use your fleet until the point that it's no longer, it's end of life, and then do your switching, because otherwise you are potentially creating a lot of extra embodied emissions. So it's something to think about, but in the way the standards work, you look at your operational emissions only when you're calculating your organizational footprint.
Great. Another question from Steve for you, Becky. Does the Toitū framework comprehend your international overseas operations, or is it intended to be New Zealand centric by design?
It should be all of your material emissions. As Bevan commented, the first step in the process is to define your scope and boundaries. So we have organisations, for instance, who work with us and they say, we're going to start with our New Zealand operation, but then we'd like to extend it to our international operations. And that's quite a common thing to do. You basically, when you start, you go, we're going to start here. These are the scope and boundaries we're going to include. And then you have to be just very transparent about what's in scope and what's not in scope. So, but it certainly works internationally. The main things that differ internationally are the emissions factors that you apply. So basically, when you're calculating the emissions associated with an activity, you apply an emissions factor. So there's an amount of fuel you burn or an amount of electricity that you use off the grid. Each country would have a different emissions factor because it would reflect how that grid electricity is produced, for instance. So in New Zealand, we have a high percentage of renewables. We have a relatively good grid emissions factor. In other countries, in Australia, for instance, if it's very, not very renewable, then it would be a higher grid factor. So it does matter that you're clear that you're using the right emissions factors.
Great, thank you, Becky. If there's no more questions, we'll give a couple of seconds if there's any more questions, just to drop it in for our panel. While we're waiting to see if there's any more questions, I just want to thank all the panelists for being part of this. It's been an amazing webinar. And also thank you for our audience. There is an evaluation form that will pop up at the end of today's session when you close out of Zoom, and we'd really love your feedback to look at building these for the future for you. So please take a couple of seconds to fill in that feedback, because we'd all love to hear from you.